제대로 찝었군.
Hi, it's me, and welcome to this overview and guide on how to use the Rosespanner Workshop Office identities in Limbus Company. The Rosespanner Workshop Office IDs were the first group of IDs that were released during Season 2, meaning that depending on when you see this, they may not be available in the dispensary, but they'll always be able to be pulled in the gacha. These IDs have two status effects tied to them, the more prominent of which being Tremor. They're actually the first faction that primarily focuses on using Tremor, so it makes sense to explain how it works. Tremor does nothing on its own, and the count reduces by 1 at the end of the turn. In order for it to provide an effect, you have to hit an enemy who has Tremor with an attack that causes a Tremor burst. This raises the stagger threshold of the enemy by the Tremor potency and doesn't reduce the count unless specified otherwise. Rosespanner Workshop also utilizes Charge for a variety of effects, but their main focus is always going to be Tremor. There are 3 IDs in this faction: Rosespanner Workshop Fixer Mersault, Rosespanner Workshop Fixer Gregor, and Rosespanner Workshop Representative Rodion. They typically inflict more Tremor count than they do Tremor potency, so they need support from other IDs if you're planning to focus on Tremor rather than the Rosespanner IDs specifically. Starting off, Rosespanner Workshop Fixer Mersault is in many ways the weakest of these 3 IDs. He's also the odd one out in that he cannot inflict Tremor count with any of his skills, but instead works with gaining additional effects when the opponent has high amounts of Tremor. There isn't much to talk about with his first skill, as it's just a decent Tremor inflicting skill compared to the other skill ones that do so. So this is a good time to mention that this is one of the faster Mersault IDs, which is useful because it means he can inflict the potency of Tremor before his allies burst it. Forced Break is his best skill for clashing, and has the additional benefit of being able to inflict attack power down next turn if the target has enough Tremor. If the first coin lands heads, this effect will always activate, even if the enemy started the turn at 0 Tremor, making it a very reliable support skill. Finishing Run-Up is his only skill that generates charge, his only way to spend charge, and his only way to burst Tremor, but it unfortunately doesn't roll fantastic for a skill 3, maxing out at only 12. Provided each hit lands heads, this skill will deal a guaranteed 8 stagger damage once you factor in the 25% Tremor damage boost on the final hit, and that's if the target has no Tremor when the attack starts. Its big downside is reducing the amount of Tremor count on the opponent by 3, which is too much for the Rosespanner faction unless you have other units who also inflict Tremor count, which you probably will if you're bringing Mersault along. Both of his passives are fueled by Gloom resources and allow him to reduce the target's clash power by 1 if they have 5 or more Tremor, which is relatively easy to inflict. This effect can definitely help him make up for his lower than average rolls, and his support passive is pretty easy to activate in Tremor teams that don't include him, so it's a nice support to include. This ID perfectly fuels Mersault's Pursuance ego, which is one of the better support ego in the game. The ego bursts Tremor without reducing its count, which is helpful for a Tremor ID that can't usually do that, but it's a lot more valuable for its support. The Awakening heals allies who have the least HP, as well as giving them protection, which is a nice emergency tool. The Corrosion is also very good support, instead giving your lowest HP allies a 30% damage boost for the next turn, which is usually very significant. The Corrosion is also a lot better for damage because it's AoE without needing to be thread spun to level 4. The passive is also pretty helpful when it activates attack power up for the next turn. Rosespanner Workshop Fixer Gregor is a lot less of a Tremor unit than it is a Rupture unit, but still has the ability to inflict Tremor count and burst Tremor. His first skill is just a build-up tool meant to give him a small amount of charge and inflict a small amount of Rupture, but it can deal decent damage. Grease Chains is the same, but functions as his Tremor count inflictor and his best tool to win clashes with a maximum value of 16 with just 1 coin. You might be noticing that the amount of charge that his skills give him is pretty low, and that's by design. He doesn't need a huge amount of charge to be entirely functional. After all, his third skill only consumes a maximum of 4 charge to inflict an equivalent amount of Rupture count on bursting Tremor. This skill is designed to deal heavy damage to a target that you've just managed to stagger as a result of bursting Tremor, but it's most useful as a means to inflict a net positive of 2 Rupture count with 3 potency. It's not a huge bonus, but any amount of positive Rupture count is noteworthy. Greg's passives with this ID allow him to inflict more Fragile if the target has Tremor. This is an ID that really wants you to build a hybrid Tremor and Rupture team to excel, but that just isn't really possible with what IDs are currently in the game. Overall though, this is still one of Gregor's better IDs, and definitely his best 2-star ID. He actually fuels his own AEDD perfectly as well. It's an okay source for him to generate charge if you can look past the passive it gives you, but once again, this is mostly useful for hybrid Rupture and Tremor team. Spark Discharge allows you to maintain Rupture count better, but the ego itself is probably more useful for generating charge for your team. Thankfully, Rosespanner Greg doesn't need much for himself, so his own charge being given to allies isn't too big of a deal. Rosespanner Workshop Representative Rogia is one of the game's best damage-dealing IDs, while simultaneously being the best unit for bursting Tremor, just not inflicting it. Her first skill gives enough charge to activate any of her charge-based effects, since you only actually need 3 for anything. This is also her only skill that isn't net negative for inflicting Tremor count, but there's a good reason for that, which we'll talk about once we get to her passive. Vibration Compression is one of the best pierce skills for damage in the entire game, being able to reuse the second coin up to twice provided that Rogia has at least 3 charge. If it rerolls both times, it will inflict a grand total of 12 Tremor, which it will then burst, dealing a significant amount of stagger damage overall, but if the enemy didn't have any Tremor count before the attack, it will also get rid of the enemy's Tremor since it reduces the count by 1. More than anything, you'll want to make sure you have at least 3 charges for this skill so that Rogia can focus on dealing high amounts of damage. Let's Rack Up Some Scores is another skill that's meant to stagger an enemy using Tremor in order to then deal bonus damage. It is the only skill in the game that can burst the Tremor of a single target more than once per use, but doesn't actually inflict very much Tremor itself, maxing out at only 3, and that's only if you land heads with the second coin. The skill itself deals pretty high damage, but what is all of this Tremor burst meant to do for you if not deal stagger damage? The reason is in her passive. Each time that she bursts Tremor, she spends 3 charge to gain 1 haste and blunt damage up for the next turn. Vibration Compression is not a blunt attack, but this passive contributes to her other skills being a lot better at dealing damage. It also makes Bursting Tremor deal 40% more stagger damage, meaning that she can do a significant amount even though she's inflicting fairly small amounts of Tremor overall. Her support passive would be somewhat helpful in Tremor teams if not for the fact that you're probably going to be bringing her with on most occasions. As a result, it isn't really worth it with what IDs are currently in the game. Her defense skill is also worth mentioning as it gives her charge at combat start. If you have 2 skill slots and only 2 charge, you can use this to fulfill the conditions of Vibration Compression's coin reuse, but this is situational and not likely to be used otherwise. This ID fuels 2 of her own ego. What is Cast is one of those, but it doesn't really synergize with anything that Rosespanner Rogia would want to do, so at best you'd use it once for the slight SP boost from its passive and then never use it a second time. More importantly, she fuels her own Rhyme Shank. This is an AoE ego that bursts Tremor and deals additional damage if the target is on high HP. That being said, this ego actually works best as an opener to inflict a high amount of sinking count to a wave of enemies, while also dealing significant blunt damage thanks to Rogia's passive. In addition, if your team has the ability to stack sinking, pretty likely considering what IDs go well with Rosespanner, this allows Rogia to inflict a good amount of bind and attack power down as well. The only shared sin affinity that these IDs have is Gloom, so let's go over some of the more helpful ego to fit with Tremor instead. We've already looked at Rhyme Shank and Pursuance, but another good ego that bursts Tremor happens to be Legerdemain. While Rosespanner Greg can't fuel it by himself, it's still pretty easy to be able to use and both bursts Tremor and inflicts a bit more on hit while being AoE, so it's a good option if you'd want to bring it along. Another good option, and not because it inflicts 4 Tremor when corroded, is Honglu's Soda. It's a great bit of sanity and HP support that can even hit multiple targets, and it's fueled perfectly by Rosespanner Gregor specifically. If you don't want to build around Fluid Sac, this is the perfect substitute for that. But you could also bring Fluid Sac. What? I mean Don's Fluid Sac, because it bursts Tremor and deals a lot of damage. Rosespanner Rogia also fuels it pretty well alongside Sync Don, so it's pretty easy to use for an attack that hits hard with this high of a roll. Lastly, Screw Loose Wallop is an ego that you're probably already bringing. Rosespanner all fuel it remarkably well, and bringing it along for the 20% damage boost is never a bad idea. In addition to that, Rosespanner Mersal is actually fast enough to sometimes be able to take advantage of the paralysis that it inflicts, making it okay for support in combat. Building a team around Tremor is not the easiest task, as you'll have to deal with the fact that the best Tremor IDs all require Wrath to build their ego. Very few good Tremor IDs have access to Wrath Sin generation, but there is one specific Tremor unit that provides one of the most helpful Sin lineups possible: LCB Sinner Heathcliff. He's without a doubt the best of the base center IDs, as well as providing Wrath, Lust, and Envy for the team, which even enables Ishmael's ego, which is important since she has some of the best Tremor IDs available. There are 3 Ishmaels that have great synergy with Tremor, all for different reasons. LC Ego Sloshing Ishmael is capable of inflicting a good amount of Tremor potency and works well in a Rupture team due to her 3rd skill, but she doesn't work great with Rosespanner due to being the only other Tremor burst that reduces Tremor count on activation, and by 4 at that. She's also the bulkiest of the Ishmael Tremor IDs if that matters to you. LCCB Ishmael inflicts a ton of Tremor count with her skill 2, which is incredibly useful when your Tremor bursts reduce the Tremor count. And lastly, Molar Boatworks Fixer Ishmael can inflict a bit of Tremor count, but is mostly useful for providing sinking support to Tremor teams, and is a lot better for damage against certain bosses as a result. Speaking of Molar Boatworks Office, Sinclair is the single best unit for inflicting large amounts of Tremor count to a single enemy. His reliability isn't as high as some others, but large amounts of Tremor count means large amounts of burst support for Rosespanner IDs. Unfortunately, both of the Molar Boatworks IDs are tied behind an event that has ended, but I did actually bring both of them to the team I built this time around. Zwei Gregor may not be the most conventional pick for a Tremor team, but he actually has really nice Sin affinities for it, and Legerdemain is very easy to fuel even by himself. He's also very fast, so you can get those Tremor bursts with Legerdemain early on in the turn, and save the Tremor count for your Rosespanner IDs to burst it a second time. Other IDs that work well in this team comp include W Corp Don Quixote for having really powerful Sin generation, as well as being able to give teammates charge using Telepole. Sunshower Heathcliff has the ability to burst Tremor, has really solid Sin generations, including Wrath using his counter, and works well with Boatworks Ishmael thanks to being able to inflict sinking. Efflorest Ego Yusang also pairs really nicely with Ishmael, but also pairs really nicely with Gregor, plus Rosespanner helps to supplement Sunshower fairly well. In addition, any team that needs Gloom or Pride resources for their ego is going to have very strong seats for any Rosespanner IDs. And that's all I have to say about the Rosespanner Workshop Office IDs and Limbus Company for now. I hope you found this guide helpful and encourage you to play around with Tremor and use these IDs. Consider liking the video if you enjoyed and subscribing if you want to see more stuff like this. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you back again soon. Bye bye!